Womanjeka! Let's transform eco-anxiety to action. Series 3 of the Two Bays podcast is a collaboration between Regeneration Projects, UN Youth Australia and RMIT University. We acknowledge the two Great Bays, Port Phillip and Western Port, which are known to Melbourne's First Peoples as Nerm and Warmarin or Murrumbik. So we show deep respect to First Nations elders across Australia, past and present, who for over 60,000 years have cared for country with rich ecological knowledge. Their leadership reminds us of our own responsibility as a B Corp and actor in the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. When you're facing a mammoth challenge, like climate change, you want the strongest allies right by your side. For young Australians, there's so much to learn and share with our friends across the ditch, across the Tasman in Aotearoa, New Zealand. With ancestral roots in southern India, Shruthi Vijayakumar has grown up in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and now calls Tāmaki Makaurau Auckland home. As a coach, facilitator and educator, she supports leaders committed to systemic change. Also living in the land of the long white cloud, Wei-Heng hails from Singapore and draws on Chinese ancestry. He's the curator of the WEF Global Shapers Community Auckland Hub and a sustainability consultant at Edge Impact, amongst many other exciting roles. Originally from Bulgaria, Vasil Samarjiev lives in Tarntanya, Adelaide, and is the Chief Youth Representation Officer at UN Youth Australia, our partner in this series. He's also now officially Australia's UN Youth Delegate for 2024. Claire Wild also hails from Aotearoa and is often a co-host in the Two Bays podcast. She works at Edge Impact as a consultant, but in this episode we'll be playing a special insights role, so really grateful to have Claire back on the podcast for this series. In a nutshell, social and environmental issues like climate change don't stick to geographic borders. So when young leaders share knowledge and experiences, we are all stronger. There's a range of international programs that bring youth climate actors all together. Kia ora koutou katoa. It's great to be creating a bridge between Aotearoa, Australia and the world in this conversation. In the spirit of our work together, let me extend our respects to Maori elders and iwi in the places where you live and work, as well as your mountains, rivers and seas. Kia ora Shruthi. It's exciting to come together once again after our many collaborations through the Fire Circle and more. How are you landing in this important Curator conversation, joining us all the way from India?
Yeah, kia ora Matt, kia ora to all of you. It's wonderful to be here and part of this conversation. It's such an important topic you bring up, Matt, in terms of like we look at the scale of climate, environmental, social, all the challenges before us. And we look at, the kind of burden, I would say, young people are receiving as we step into the future, which is significant. And it's tough, it's painful, the suffering can be overwhelming. And there's just so much wisdom and opportunity and change that I feel this generation is tapping into. And there's so much hope, I feel, about the new system that the world is kind of thirsty for and calling for, that, young people, I feel, are better placed than any other generation to kind of bring forward. So really, feeling both the mammothedness of the challenge, I like the word you used, but also the hope and possibility before us, and really wonderful to be sharing learnings across the ditch. So excited to jump in, excited to lean into our roots, our Māori roots here in Aotearoa, our ancestral roots all around the world, and see how our different streams come together to show us the way forward in this time.
Thank you, Shruthi. And I think that tension already that you bring in around that hope and that aspiration, but also that, sometimes the heaviness and frustration and that duality that many of the elders that we've been privileged to work with are often so quick to remind us that they can coexist. And sometimes there's a little bit of irony there. But thank you for bringing that to light so quickly. Kia ora, Pok. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself so that listeners can get to know you a little bit better?
Yeah, hello everyone. It's really lovely to be connecting with you all and to be part of this broader conversation. Yeah, a little bit about me. I kind of like draw different disciplines. I did 2 years in theater school, and then after that, my parents threw me into accounting, and I did that as an undergraduate course. And then the first job that I arrived at wasn't an accountant; it was a climate change consultant, and I think it was because it was driven by me wanting to connect domains of the heart with domains of the mind. I asked weird and interesting questions like accounting teaches us how to value things. How might we learn how to better value the world? And how might we learn to cherish it better? And so then begin a whole interesting career and world and life into climate change. And I think once you open the climate change Pandora box, you think of a lot of things. We think of equity, we think of justice, we think of systems. We also think about organizing every and all of us. And so, yes, perhaps that's where I start, and then we can continue chatting from there. That's a bit about me. Thank you.
Yeah, we're setting the scene beautifully here. Thank you for adding. Vasil, Womanjeka, episode 3. We're really building momentum in this Transforming Eco Anxiety to Action series. What are you most looking forward to in this particular episode?
Yes, kia ora, Matt, kia ora, everyone. It's very exciting to be, 3 episodes in, and I can only say that I'm getting more and more excited with each one. I think up until now, we have just scratched the surface, but we have mostly been situating ourselves into the youth context in Australia. So I'm actually particularly excited to not only learn but also share about how some of these experiences are very similar across the Tasman. I bring together the experience of some young Australians like myself who last year went to Aotearoa to try to learn a little bit about what Indigenous reconciliation actually means in Aotearoa, as well as what else is happening around Indigenous issues. We in Australia look at Aotearoa as a country that has been able to move past in a very beautiful way. And although not all of my very positive expectations were met, there's definitely some room for improvement on both ends. I think some of our experiences are very beautifully similar, and I'm very excited to keep chatting.
Thanks, Vasila. And absolutely, this strength of the bridge between our nations, our communities, is one that's deep. So, there's some great people on this conversation today that perhaps can help, support UN Youth Australia's connections into Aotearoa more. Womanjeka, Claire, here we are. Really nice to be seeing you, and really curious to notice what jumps out to you in this particular conversation. What comes to mind now as we start off, we have used continuously this idea of unapologetic boldness in these types of conversations, and a license that it can give, the people when we convene a safe space and just say, hey, go for it. What's present for you, and what tips would you give our guests for this conversation in embracing that license?
Yeah, so I think this episode feels like a bit of a blast from the past in some ways, because Matt, in a very early iteration of this podcast, we ran something called the Trans-Tasman Regen podcast, and it was all about sharing stories, as you mentioned, Vasil, between Aotearoa, New Zealand and Australia. And as someone who's lived and worked in both countries, on both sides of the Tasman, I think we often look to each other as somehow being better. I know that in New Zealand, a lot of the rhetoric can sometimes be Australia's bigger and better. And sometimes we've used that as a way, almost as a cop-out, for not really being quite as bold as we could be. And then I think in Australia, often living and working in Australia, we look over to Aotearoa. And as you said, Vasil, you have these really high expectations for what relationships between, Pākehā and Māori might be like over there, and, things like honouring Te Tiriti o Waitangi, or the treaty over in New Zealand. And I think often we put one another on a pedestal, and actually when you're there and you're in it and working in it, it's sometimes not as rosy as we may have thought when we were on the other side. So something I'd really encourage Poc and Shruthi and Vasil to talk about today is, your perceptions of Aotearoa and Australia respectively, and also, the broader world and how that might compare to your actual experiences being and working in those places.
Well said. Well, we are setting up for a really interesting conversation here. Vasil, I'm going to come back to you as we take this first step. You mentioned UN Youth Australia runs its annual Aotearoa Leadership Tour. To get us going, would you like to share how the program supports young people to strengthen their leadership, and that including on issues like climate change?
Yes, I will start off by saying that up until this year, including the time that I was involved in the program, it was called the Aotearoa Leadership Tour. But since then, we have actually dropped the L. We have dropped the leadership. The reason for that is the concept of the tour is 16 young Australians from across Australia are taken by 4 young facilitators, one of which was myself last year, to Aotearoa, New Zealand, for a 2 weeks experience where we travel mostly around the North Island. So we visit Waitangi, as well as Auckland, Wellington, and Rotorua, to essentially try to understand what, again, being in touch with First Nations, as we call it in Australia, First Nations people actually means for people who have come since, in particular how Maori and Pakeha interact and have kind of institutionalized that interaction. And what does that mean for young people who are not only trying to grasp, this relationship between Maori and Pakeha, but also are trying to grasp young people's relationship with the system in the issues that we're talking about, one of which being climate change. How does that relationship affect their ability to be involved in climate change matters, in matters that matter to them outside of being from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and how similar or not so similar that is to the experiences of young Australians who grow up with hopefully the intent and interest in understanding their relationship with our First Nations communities in Australia. So the premise of this tour was UN Youth Australia, actually, for most of our activities, we run our own educational workshops where we research, as young people, we research topics that we would like to then convey to high school or primary school students, and then we adapt that to our own content. This trip includes none of that, mostly because we, as facilitators and as educators, or so-called educators, we come to Aotearoa to learn as well and to listen. So one of the little iterations of the name before we decided to drop the L altogether was to be the Aotearoa Listening Tour, because the purpose of it is we go to Aotearoa to listen, and we have meetings and consultations, as we call them, with elders, with academics, and with young people, as well as undertake different experiences and cultural experiences in Aotearoa to understand from people on the ground with lived experiences what that relationship looks like. So leadership didn't turn out to be, although it sounds fancy, is not actually the thing that we were achieving by the end. Young people were almost afraid to be leaders because they found out that they know a lot less about these relationships and about their place in this relationship than they thought at the start. So while they came wanting to be leaders, by the end they realized that's not their role. Their role is to support each other and be part of a broader community that almost feeds off of richness to build up on each other's uniqueness rather than take the lead and make everyone else who is just as unique as you are follow. So that's it in a nutshell. And it is a very beautiful, I guess, trip and activity that I got involved as since then. I visited Aotearoa 3 more times, which I hadn't planned on, but I just loved it so much that I visited not only the north but the south as well now, which has been very exciting as well.
Great, Vasil, and I think that repositioning that you've shared there is a really interesting one. And Shruthi, we actually teamed up on an article about the power of young people adopting an ecological leadership mindset. And I'm just walking into this next question with very much awareness of Vasil's comments here, but let's lean in anyhow. Would you like to step through a couple of the principles that we earmarked in that article, and also your perspective on when we talk about transforming eco-anxiety to action, we're not just talking about external actions, are we? Do you want to jump in?
Young people recognize we need to design our system differently, the way it's built, the colonial capitalist structures, the way of seeing humans as separate from nature, seeing nature as a resource, being so individualistic oriented as simply not serving our well-being, nature's well-being, the humanity's well-being. And in that kind of journey of how do we then transform the system, I think the greatest teachers for me personally, and I think is the opportunity for young people to lean into on both sides of the ditch, is our Indigenous elders and our Indigenous wisdom and our own ancestral wisdom, whatever that might be it my Indian roots, be it, Pox, Asian roots, Matt, your Norwegian roots, whatever that might be as well. We're all Indigenous to the earth, as some of our teachers have taught us. And so in that journey of reconnecting with Indigenous wisdom, what I've been learning and what I've been supporting young people that I coach and educate and work with is really, we can look at, climate change work and systems change work as here's me, individual Shruthi, and all these young people trying to change a system, which feels really heavy and burdensome because I'm so small and the problem is this big. There's also another space we can look at the problem from, where I discover, not just intellectually, but really in my being, that I am a part of Mother Earth, that I am a part of an interconnected whole. And I mean, Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese monk, speaks so beautifully, like, I cannot exist without the sun is in me, the water is in me, the earth is in me. Like the banana I ate in this morning was in the soil before, now it's in me. Like in a very tangible way, we know we are nature, and yet somehow we've got this ego that thinks I'm separate and I need to worry and fear for myself. And you can even tie that back to the nervous system when you're in this sort of fight or flight response. And so the more we can support our young people to go on this sort of inner journey to rediscover that actually I am a part of this interconnected whole. I'm connected to my ancestors. I'm connected to future generations. So this way there's a line. I'm connected to the earth. I'm connected to all the animals, all life. And to really feel that, when I feel that sense of connectedness, wow, I'm so powerful, Matt. Not I'm powerful. There is so much power and potential. And we know that Mother Earth can do anything. Like Shruthi might be small, but Mother Earth is vast. The wisdom of my ancestors is vast. And so taking us into that space requires a lot of like internal decolonization, dismantling, getting out of our heads into our hearts and our bodies, getting out of the I think I know to actually I don't know. Because when there's that I don't know and that openness, we can tune into the wisdom. And I love what Japati, one of our elders in Arnhem Land, has taught us, Matt. When you calm your mind, your body, your spirit, you can hear Mother Earth speak. But most of us in the West, in our anxiousness, there's so much mental chatter that we're not able to tune into that space of quiet, that space of wisdom. Again, you can track that to the nervous system, the state when you're in your ventral vagal. So it's got a it's not just sort of some spiritual woo. It's got a real biological sort of mirroring as well. And so I guess to bring this to kind of a close, the work, I think, and the opportunity for young people is to tap back into our own ancestral wisdom, different Indigenous wisdom systems, and they're all kind of pointing to the same truths. You've got, I don't want to dilute the beautiful diversity, but the essence of so many of our Indigenous teachers are all saying, we are one with Earth. Mother Earth is a mother to be respected. We are not a separate self. We are part of an interconnected whole. And the more we can support our young people to heal and not act from anxiety, because when anxiety fuels your action, you reinforce the anxiety. So any action stemming from anxiety, I think, is creating more of the problem. But as that anxiety arises practically, there are many tools, and we can get practical if we wish, be it mindfulness, be it time in nature, be it, sort of peer support networks, be it our own spiritual practices. The more we can, rather than act on the anxiety, but come and plug back into that wholeness and act from that space, be guided from that space, be a vessel for wisdom and action from that space, that kind of action is going to be the action that actually builds a new system that, gets a project in my community going that improves the dynamics in my family or with the policymakers that aren't hearing me. And so that's the exciting work that's really in that article that we've written about how we plug back into the wisdom of nature, the wisdom of our own indigeneity, and bring that to how we approach climate action systems change work, which I feel we in New Zealand and Australia are so lucky to be more plugged into our Indigenous elders, because you don't get it so easily in other parts of the West, be it in Europe and the US, but in our parts of the world, we are so lucky to have this wisdom there. And if we can respect and turn to it, I think it's these knowledge keepers that can really lead us forward.
Thank you, Shruthi. There's a beautiful run that you were on there, and I think some really poignant points, particularly Vasil, I'm looking to you because I'm noticing how we've gone on this first episode, and we were setting the scene, and we really went to the heart, let's say, of the climate action movement, or youth-led climate action movement, when we had the School Strike for Climate team joining us. And then in the next episode, we went on that discovery of looking at academic research and industry research and different voices coming in. And we're here dropping into quite a different space, and we're sensing that when we lean out and we hold the shoulder or the arm of our friends in Aotearoa here, and we support each other, then in doing that we also open up this conversation around our First Peoples and what kind of action. Shruthi, I think that's such a powerful point. What kinds of action are we talking about? Because it seems to be that our own state of being is part of the action transformation that we're talking about. Poc, this feels like a launching pad for you to take off here. We had a really brilliant conversation in the lead up to the recording, and I was really moved in many ways by you sharing your own story and pursuit of finding, let's say, an action pathway as a broad banner, but some of the things that you talked about when we were speaking on the phone yesterday was you had this feeling that in this pursuit you were being actively repelled by the system, not matching a framing of success that is conventionally recognized, and this sense of graceful acceptance that you have had to navigate here, but not necessarily, with ease all of the time. And you talked about themes around faith, and you talked about us cosplaying as adults, trying to navigate and search through life. But I'm curious, as we're joining this conversation now, can you tell us a little bit more about your pursuit towards action and the way that you've leaned into and are continuing to lean into, let's say, quite Western institutions, but to challenge and to protagonize and to just be yourself and to let that be a change-making action force in its own right?
That is a great question, Matt. I'm gonna offer some hot takes. So when I first started working, I was so sure that my life had to be focused on big conventional success. I remember looking at the board and going you know what? I might want to give Forbes 30 under 30 a shot. What is it gonna take? What's my 6 to 7 year plan to achieve this coveted title? What am I gonna do? How many awards do I need to get? How many coveted positions do I need to be? Do I need to be a manager at a consulting firm before I'm 25? And it's just so interesting how quickly we can get absorbed in these kind of what I call them proxies of meaning. We surround ourselves with these titles as though they mean something, when actually so much of what is around our world can be quite artificial. For example, our belief shapes our reality. Our belief in the dollar bill is what sustains the economy. And it's if we all cumulatively did not believe in the economy overnight, it would just currencies would collapse, which is what has happened in some parts of the world. But for example, there are things that are enduring in our world. The oceans are enduring. The forests live. And so I think it's always really funny that we surround ourselves with these proxies of meaning without quite understanding sometimes that there are things in our life that are enduring and actually part of our ecosystem. One of the things I talked about was that when I first started my journey in climate change, it was a deeply environmental question. The question I had was, what is carbon dioxide? How is it harming the atmosphere? How do I reduce carbon emissions? How do I do my role? And now slowly, with this realization that I might not be Forbes 30 under 30, it has become a weird spiritual question. The spiritual question I ask myself is, what does it mean to live a life worth living? And in the life worth living, I don't know. Am I holding like a Louis Vuitton bag? Like am I driving a massive like expensive car? And slowly I felt like the artifacts in my life that I thought represented fortune, fame, brilliance didn't seem that important. Perhaps like what centered a life worth living for me was connection. It was mending the broken bonds I had with family. It was learning how to forgive. It was learning how to understand the good and bad in life and to move forward. It was integrating myself and understanding nature. And so that was interesting for me and yet very terrifying because it meant having to, I grew up in Singapore. Capitalism is at its peak over there. Like, I had to leave this conditioning that capitalism was the main pinnacle of my life, to imagining something else, to starting to take those baby steps. And that's why we talked about how I've started to apply for a fellowship this year to write climate fiction. And I never write fiction, but it's about I've been immersed in this world for so long. What does it mean to redream something else entirely? And the quote I keep returning back to, and this is by a playwright called Jonathan Larson, is that the opposite of war isn't peace, it's creation. And I think in this world where right now, there's a lot of geopolitical rife. The waves are choppy in our lives right now. Everything that we thought was stable can sometimes be flipped. But what's important for us is not only to campaign for peace and maybe a sense of stability, it's also to ask ourselves, what is the way forward? Now that I know what I know about climate change, yeah, like we've got to campaign and take to the streets. And what else? And what will I create? And what is my role? And what have I learned? And I think like that is part of perhaps the magic, because like it's like peeling an onion. It just keeps going on, and it's like it's up to you how many layers you want to peel. But life is boundless. Life is pretty exciting, and it's okay to be a bit whimsical and playful and just be a trickster and just approach life with a sense of boundless wonder and curiosity. I hope that is my secret to me staying alive till I'm 100 years old. But yes.
Brilliant, Pock, and I think it's really it's a welcome. It feels like a bit of a breeze, like a cool breeze on a warm day, as you share that playfulness. Because sometimes in the heaviness and the frustration of the anxiety, there's this feeling that we can feel, and I know that many young people feel. We saw that in the statistics. Basically 4 out of 5 people are in Australia, and perhaps in Aotearoa and other places as well, no doubt, have this heaviness, this kind of sense, and even not knowing the word eco-anxiety, but you start opening the space and it comes out. But then to reach out and let that joy come in, it's brilliant. And to think, climate fiction, I'm so curious. Like, Pock, please keep us updated on that, because the world and the plots, maybe some of that might be more real than some of the actual realities that we've painted for ourselves now. Claire, I'm just going to come across to you for a moment. Do you think we're living up to our expectations of that unapologetic boldness in this conversation so far?
100%. I was scribbling down some nuggets of wisdom that Shruthi and Pock were sharing as they were talking. And I think it's so interesting because Pock and I get to work together a lot every day. And in our work, we work as sustainability consultants, and we're often speaking to all sorts of organizations and all sorts of people in all sorts of roles who are at all levels along the spectrum of you could call it the sustainability journey. So some people are super fresh to the idea of sustainability. Some people are, right up kind of at that leading edge. And I think often when you talk to people, it feels really complex. And sustainability is, as Poc said, is it about understanding exactly the mechanisms of how, CO2 in the atmosphere creates climate change and how we can get that number down? And, sometimes we're trying to convince people that it's a really good idea to report against certain reporting frameworks because, it's the law now that you have to produce reports about your climate change impacts and things like that. And I think what Poc and Shruthi both said, to those people that we're talking to who are often very much working in this system of capitalism, and as Poc said, sometimes that's all based around proxies of meaning, so things like profit and how can we do sustainability while also not damaging our profit or that proxy of meaning in that case. And it can feel really overwhelming. And I think something that Poc and I have probably touched on quite a lot when we're figuring out how to work really well with these people is how you can build that really inherent understanding that both Poc and Shruthi have talked about, which is that visceral knowledge that nature is good and it's worth protecting. Shruthi, and I might misquote you here, but you said something around being part of Mother Earth and sort of, you are Mother Earth and we are all Mother Earth. And, Poc talked about how nature is enduring. And I think these kinds of statements just really reflect the fact that it doesn't have to be complicated. And sometimes we try and overcomplicate it when we're trying to fit things like sustainability and regeneration and care for nature into this sort of capitalist system we've made. And so actually just making things really simple is sometimes the best way to go about it. So that's kind of what's been in my mind. And just one other reflection from me is that I often look back to my 4-year-old self, and I think 4-year-old Claire knew a lot of things that adult Claire sometimes forgot. And I think if 4-year-old Claire was listening to this conversation and hearing what Poc and Shruthi were saying, she'd be saying, of course, that makes total sense. And so I think it's just kind of funny that these proxies of meaning that we've made in our world around things like big hefty titles and 30 under 30, forms lists and profit and growth and all these things have actually made us a bit silly. And maybe if we come back to the things that we know deep down, then maybe we'll all be better off. So that's a reflection from me.
Vasil, it feels like we are on a little landing place or another stepping stone on this Aotearoa listening tour that you've been talking about, because we're kind of there, and I've got no idea whether this is in line with some of the conversations you're having over there, but I am curious for those listeners that might be interested in exploring how to get involved with this listening tour that you do, and maybe partaking in conversations like these and these kind of intercultural exchanges, and thinking about that depth of relationship with Maori and Pakeha or First Nations, non-First Nations knowledge. How do people actually get involved? What's the process?
Oh, I think in terms of the Aotearoa tour, the unfortunate reality is that there's very few spots. So we do have an application process, but unlike some of the other application processes that young people might have heard about or applied for, where there's this rigid hierarchy and you have to provide that you're on the Forbes 30 under 30 list, if we're dissing that now. Unlike that, what we do have is a big focus on your passion, interest, and what you will do with that experience in the future. So we want a lot of our young people that came on board last year have gone on to study climate change policy or to work in the space. A lot of them are currently drafting up things for MPs to try to influence some policy that is currently happening across the country. But in terms of young people getting involved in this space outside of just the Aotearoa tour, I think we talk about it in the past episode. We talked about this generational gap and this idea that young people are not listened to by old people, and that we are told that we have to fix everyone's challenges, but we are not there yet. I think a lot of that comes from ego and comes from not listening properly to each other. So I think what Aotearoa Tour is trying to do is something that everyone can participate in, is listening to elders, listening to people that are older, but also to elders and to older generations, to listen to young people without judgments, but with understanding. And that is something very basic, but something that, as Claire said, we do tend to overcomplicate, particularly with age. So
Yeah, it's a good point that you make, that people can participate in these practices or this skill building around listening. As you say that, one of the voices of an elder here, it's also had Fire Circle connections, Nawi, Dr. Carolyn Briggsam, she uses a phrase, yulenge, but it means deep listening and knowledge. And I think the heart of, I think, that listening tour is the listening practice. So that, that can happen at home, it can happen in workplaces, but I think that's a really important point. Poc, in the world that we're in, people are looking for pathways, and one of the pathways that you've found is this World Economic Forum and Global Shapers program. Do you want to just talk about how people can find out about that? Because I understand that that's it is a global initiative, and also what people can expect from that type of experience.
Absolutely. So the Global Shapers is a program by the World Economic Forum in the form of city-based hubs that are looking to improve the outcomes of cities and to increase social impact or environmental impact. And so, for example, in Australia, there are hubs in the Gold Coast, Canberra, Melbourne, Sydney, the list goes on. And for example, in New Zealand, there are 3 hubs in Auckland, Wellington, and Christchurch. And so I would really encourage any youth between the age of 18 to 30, that is the range that's been set, to have a look at the Global Shapers, to be open to the different opportunities, firstly, that the World Economic Forum might be willing to extend, but also as a forum to be with other like-minded young people that are really interested in jostling for change, that want to envision a more livable city, or a city that takes certain issues more seriously. And I think that was a really lovely forum that still continues to provide me with excellent opportunities. And even today, we've just concluded a meeting to talk about how do we we're talking about communication pieces on like Auckland transport history. How has transport been like in Auckland City? What are the gridlocks we face, and what is the benefit of unlocking public transport in the region? We're having conversations about reactivating third spaces. How might we continue to activate third spaces that promote community togetherness? And we are also talking about reinvigorating our library. So there's a lot of active discussion that happens in these hubs. That's just Auckland's example. I'm sure that in the other cities, there's a lot that's going to come out of it, but definitely encourage any young person that might have an interest in city-based impact to approach these hubs and see if you can collaborate or be a shaper yourself.
Brilliant. That's good. It's just good to be putting out these opportunities so that people can become aware of what's available. And sometimes, you just don't know until someone shares that entry point. Shruthi, I'm very aware of your own coaching and support that you offer leaders, including young leaders. So curious if you might share a little bit about that, but also other pathways, other programs and things that you've seen that you think are really good examples of when people are feeling that climate anxiety or that interest in systems change, how they can step forward and find a safe space to continue that pursuit and learning.
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. 2 that came to mind listening to this conversation, particularly around systems change. One that's been really wonderful in my journey of connecting that sort of head work and the heart work has been Theory U, which is a sort of approach to awareness-based systems change that came out of MIT University, but really, I think, begins to bridge some of I wouldn't go as far as using the word Indigenous, but different worldviews and ways of thinking and sensing that sort of lean into that direction. And they have an online course that's free called ULab. It's got hubs around the world, so you've got an in-person community online calls, an amazing global network. I did an in-person course with them over in the UK many years ago, and it's probably one of the best trainings I've done on facilitating processes for systems change with groups, and enhanced my own coaching practice a lot. So Theory U, ULab, definitely easy, accessible. Fridtjof Capra, he's another really interesting systems thinker. He's a physicist and biologist by training, and Austrian or German from memory. But he's also explored like Eastern mysticism and spirituality at great length. And he's got a book called The Tao of Physics, The Systems View of Life, where he links sort of biology, chemistry, organizational systems, family systems, health systems, takes Eastern, Western worldviews, kind of brings them together. It's quite an intellectually oriented course, and just really rich and quite different to a lot of the education we might get as young people in our schooling and university. And he's got an online course you can do. They've got scholarships, a huge textbook. It's quite hard to read, but if you kind of like that stimulation, it's really kind of broadened my own understanding of systems and added a real like scientific component. So those are kind of two spaces to learn. Then there's of course lots in the economic systems change world, like donor economics, small is beautiful, Schumacher's work, Buddhist economics. I mean, there's a whole world out there that we can get into. So I think that there's lots, I guess maybe the challenge is as a young person trying to like get a sense of what you're not hearing in the classroom, what you're not hearing from your professors. And I remember being an economics student myself and often being like, this doesn't resonate. Like, what do you mean humans are only self-interested and only act for their own benefits? Like, I like helping people, like, but there was no way to express that. But like, really honor what feels true for you, because your professors might be like, nope. And I got told off by my economics professors for asking silly questions, and that's not how economics works. But there's some wisdom in you, so kind of try and seek, like, honor that. Don't hush that voice that's like, this doesn't feel right, and seek that, because there's a lot of perspectives and a lot of great thinkers from all corners of the world that already exist out there that we might not be exposed to, that aren't in the mainstream, that aren't on our social media feeds. But there's so much great. Like, we don't have to really reinvent the wheel. I think it's just deepening our own learning. And the last thing I might just add in terms of teachers and sources of learning, Matt, is nature. I mean, nothing beats going and learning from nature firsthand. And you can read all the books and do all the courses, but for me, like, trying to spend a few days a week where I spend an hour sitting under a tree by a stream, somewhere in your local neighborhood is best, and just sitting quietly and watching nature and speak to Mother Earth. It might sound strange, but try it out and share with her your questions and your desires, and watch her change through the seasons, watch her evolve, watch how she addresses the illnesses when they arise in the plants. Like, there's just so much we can learn firsthand from the greatest teacher. And a lot of our scriptures say nature is the best teacher. She's the first teacher. She's a manifestation of the creation or God or consciousness, whatever word you want to use. And as Pog said, she's what's enduring. She's been here long before our challenges and will endure long before we leave this earth.
It is a brilliant melting pot that we're creating here. Claire?
I would say, okay, I'm going to draw on another theme that I've heard everyone talk about, which is something I think I'm surprised to be thinking. So we started this conversation talking about the burden of, the really challenging issues facing the world, and especially facing young people as we look to the future. And Shruthi talked about anxiety. And I think a lot of us, including myself, can jump to anxiety as a response when you're really feeling the heavy weight of that burden. And then again, when I'm hearing things that everyone in this call is, or in this conversation is saying, Shruthi and Pok and Vasil, there are so many themes around. I think the word cherish came up a lot. In this, Pok, you talked about the opposite of war is creation. And I think this idea of joy and love for nature and love for one another is really the theme that's come up for me so much, which I think is really lovely to hear, given the, one of the major reasons that we're doing this series in the Two Bays podcast is because of the youth mental health crisis associated, and the associated links with, ecosystem crisis. So I think this idea of joy and cherishing nature coming into that as a solution is a pretty wonderful thing. Maybe it's not a solution, maybe that's even the wrong way of looking at it, but sort of one way of healing is pretty special.
It is special, and I think it shows the different types of action that when we talk about transforming eco-anxiety to action, sometimes we think that it's, it's the climate strike, or we think that it's the letter to the Prime Minister, or we think that it's, the 30 by 30 by 30, that is another target, but, achieving so much by, being 30 years of age, these types of things. And we have heard different pathways in this conversation, but might be that the simplest pathway could be literally the one that takes you down to your local river and an opportunity to chill out and just to be. Folks, this has been a brilliant conversation, and I want to thank Poc, Claire, Shruthi, and also Vasil for joining us. Vasil, it has felt like part of the UN Youth Australia's listening tour of Aotearoa, and yes, we've circled around this theme of leadership, but what comes through is just that power that when we do sit around a circle with a group of supportive peers, that even after an hour or a little bit less than an hour, we can walk away feeling that joy that you speak of, Claire. And I think that as an action is a really important one to practice, because sometimes the external things are a little bit harder to change. They take a little bit more time, but those internal things, if we can find safe spaces to create that kind of joy, it's a really important thing to invest in. So, folks, Nung Gudjin, and until next time, this has been the Two Bays podcast. Cheers. This Two Bays series, Transforming Eco-Anxiety to Action, is part of Regeneration Project's ongoing work in building young Australians' ecological literacy, leadership, and entrepreneurship skills. If you're an educator, employer, decision maker, or a young person passionate about positive change, go to our new website, twobays.earth, to discover our new app, educational workshops, and capacity building programs. Folks, that's a wrap. Thanks to our series partners, UN Youth Australia and RMIT University, special guests, researching, advocating, and innovating solutions, and listeners. Remember, subscribe to Two Bays on your favourite podcast platform and Instagram. My name is Matt, and on behalf of Regeneration Projects, Nung Gudjin, thank you for tuning in, and see you on the next episode of the Two Bays podcast.